August 6, 1942. The carrier Shokaku rested motionless in Truk Lagoon, its vast flight deck deserted and its hangars silent as a tomb. Deep below, in a dim conference room clouded with cigarette smoke, 5 Japanese naval officers sat around a table strewn with maps, casualty lists, and intelligence briefings. The meeting had dragged on for 3 tense hours. For the last 10 minutes, not a word had been spoken. At last, Rear Admiral Tamman Yamaguchi exhaled sharply and broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we must face what these figures make painfully clear. The war is lost." The words hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. No one spoke. No objections were needed. Every man at the table understood the truth. It was August 6th, 1942, 2 months to the day since Midway, and the consequences of that defeat were now undeniable. Japan had surrendered the momentum it once possessed, perhaps never to regain it. The bitter irony was unmistakable. The very strike meant to cripple American naval might at Pearl Harbor had, in the end, sealed Japan's downfall. To grasp how these admirals arrived at such a grim realization, we must turn back the clock 8 months, to the morning of December 7th, 1941. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's meticulously orchestrated assault unfolded with devastating precision. Japanese bombers crippled or destroyed 8 U.S. battleships, obliterated 188 aircraft, and left 2,403 Americans dead. It was, by all appearances, a flawless execution strategy, almost. Yet to the discerning eye, its fatal oversights were visible from the start. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in harbor and escaped unharmed. The vast fuel depots holding millions of gallons of vital oil were never struck. The submarine base went untouched, and the repair docks remained fully operational. What seemed a perfect victory had, in truth, left America's most essential assets unscathed. Yamamoto is reported to have confessed after the assault. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." There is considerable debate among historians about whether Yamamoto truly spoke those words. Yet Japanese naval intelligence reports from early 1942 make it clear that the senior admirals recognized a fleeting chance for strategic advantage. Analysis at the time estimated that Japan had only 6 to 8 months before American industrial capacity would decisively eclipse Japan's strengths in training, experience, and forward positioning. That narrow margin dictated urgency. By August 1942, that critical window had vanished, leaving Japan struggling to maintain momentum and facing the full force of a resurgent American war machine. The Battle of Midway, fought in early June 1942, marked a devastating turning point for Japan. 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost, representing more than mere vessels. They were vital combat platforms staffed by highly trained pilots who could not be quickly replaced. Japan had entered the conflict with 10 fleet carriers, but by August 1942, only 6 remained, 2 of which were already damaged. In contrast, the United States was producing carriers at a pace that shocked Japanese naval strategists, signaling a shift in the balance of naval power. On August 6th, inside the cramped, smoke-filled conference room, the Japanese admirals examined intelligence that laid bare the full extent of their strategic crisis. American shipyards were constructing more than a dozen fleet carriers, including the formidable Essex-class carriers, ships larger and far more advanced than anything Japan could produce. The first of these vessels would be ready by early 1943, and by 1944, American naval strength would achieve such overwhelming numerical superiority that Japan's defensive plans would be rendered entirely unworkable, leaving the empire exposed to an unstoppable maritime force. Yet the fleet numbers were only part of the larger problem. The intelligence also revealed the staggering scale of American aircraft production. In 1941, U.S. factories had turned out roughly 19,000 military planes, compared to Japan's 5,000. But the disparity was growing at an alarming rate. American output was accelerating rapidly, while Japanese industry barely managed to sustain existing levels. By 1943, estimates projected the United States could produce as many as 85,000 aircraft each year, whereas Japan might reach only 16,000 even under ideal conditions, highlighting an increasingly insurmountable imbalance. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the officer who had commanded the aerial assault on Pearl Harbor, attended the August conference despite still recovering from wounds sustained at Midway. His expertise in carrier operations was indispensable for planning Japan's next moves. Fukuda delivered an assessment that struck a severe blow to morale. When the war began, Japanese naval aviation boasted around 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots, arguably the finest in the world. By August 1942, however, roughly 40% had been killed in battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the relentless attrition across the Solomon Islands. Those who remained were overworked, flying multiple missions daily with minimal rest. Their effectiveness steadily eroded. At the same time, Japanese pilot training programs were managing to produce only about 100 new carrier-qualified pilots each month. These recruits had accumulated roughly 200 flight hours, a fraction of the 800-plus hours that veteran pilots had logged before the war. By contrast, American pilot production painted a far more favorable picture for the Allies. The United States was training thousands of pilots every month. While their early training was less rigorous, the sheer volume meant that losses could be quickly replaced. Japan, however, could not recover its skilled personnel at the same pace. Every seasoned Japanese pilot lost represented an irreplaceable asset. Fukuda projected that, if attrition continued at the current rate, Japan would exhaust its pool of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, no matter how many carriers remained in service. The situation with submarine warfare was equally dire. Despite advanced designs, Japanese submarines had achieved only limited success, largely confined to supporting fleet operations rather than targeting enemy commerce. In contrast, American submarines were increasingly disrupting Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off critical supply lines. Japan's economy relied almost entirely on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and iron or from various sources. All of these vital materials had to pass through sea lanes increasingly controlled and patrolled by U.S. submarines, threatening to strangle Japan's industrial and military capabilities. Admiral Yamamoto outlined the escalating toll on Japanese merchant shipping. In January 1942, the nation lost 15 vessels, but by June the figure had doubled to 30 per month. By August, losses had climbed to 40 ships each month, creating a grim trajectory. If this pattern continued, by 1944 Japan would lack sufficient merchant tonnage to sustain even its basic economy, let alone supply its military. Shipbuilding efforts were far behind the pace of destruction. Japan could construct roughly 200,000 tons of merchant vessels annually, yet was losing 300,000 tons each year, with losses accelerating, threatening an increasingly unsustainable collapse of logistical capacity. The strategic outlook for Japan was equally alarming. In just 6 months, the empire had seized vast territories: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and countless Pacific islands. While impressive, this rapid expansion created a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. Protecting it required spreading Japanese forces thinly across dozens of garrisons, many isolated difficult to supply and impossible to reinforce quickly. The Americans, in contrast, could concentrate their power, striking where and when they chose. Japan, however, had to defend every point simultaneously. This fundamental imbalance favored the Allies, even if forces were equal. But in reality, American strength was rising while Japanese capabilities were eroding, making the outcome of the conflict increasingly inevitable. One admiral cautiously suggested exploring the possibility of a negotiated peace, perhaps offering to return some of the territories Japan had seized might persuade the United States to agree to a ceasefire. His proposal was met with scornful laughter. Every admiral in the room had studied the intelligence summaries of American public sentiment. The outrage over Pearl Harbor had ignited a resolve far stronger than Japanese planners had anticipated. The attack, intended to cow America into negotiations, had instead galvanized the nation. War bonds were oversubscribed, factories operated around the clock, and women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Any hope of compromise was gone. The United States demanded nothing less than Japan's unconditional surrender. The discussion shifted to analyzing the causes of failure. While the Pearl Harbor strike had succeeded tactically, its strategic consequences were disastrous. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had led the carrier strike force during the attack, shared his assessment. The operation had aimed to eliminate American battleship strength, providing Japan with a 6-month window to solidify its conquest before the United States could mount an effective response. The underlying assumption was that sustained defeats over half a year would pressure American public opinion into demanding negotiations. However, events had proven this premise entirely mistaken. Rather than cowing the United States, the attack hardened its resolve, exposing the fundamental flaw in Japan's strategic calculations. First, battleships were no longer the decisive instruments of naval power. Aircraft carriers had taken that role. By failing to locate and strike the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan left the nation's most vital naval assets intact. Second, the planners had gravely misjudged American public sentiment. Far from demoralizing the nation, the attack unified it, creating an unprecedented wave of resolve. Third, Pearl Harbor granted the United States the moral high ground on the global stage, facilitating alliances and access to critical resources. Fourth, and perhaps most damaging, the operation's execution unintentionally cast Japan as duplicitous. Diplomats were meant to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the assault, but delays in decoding meant it arrived only after hostilities had begun. The assault thus appeared as a treacherous sneak attack, flagrantly violating international norms. American propaganda seized on this, branding December 7th a day of infamy. Japan had, unintentionally, handed the United States an unmistakable rallying cry that would fuel the nation's war effort. Admiral Yamaguchi produced another report, one that deepened the sense of alarm in the room. It detailed the April 1942 Doolittle raid, in which 16 B-25 bombers had launched from the carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical destruction was minimal, scattered buildings damaged, and only a handful of casualties, but the strategic impact was profound. The raid shattered the long-held illusion that the Japanese homeland was untouchable, demonstrating that American carriers could reach the home islands. As a result, Japan was forced to retain aircraft and troops in the homeland for defense, diverting critical resources from other fronts. Most consequentially, the raid spurred the High Command to accelerate the planning of the Midway operation, an ambitious offensive that would ultimately end in a catastrophic defeat, underscoring the widening strategic imbalance facing Japan. The Midway operation warranted close scrutiny. The plan had been intricate, relying on multiple Japanese task forces approaching from different directions to confuse and overwhelm American defenses. In practice, this complexity created serious coordination issues. The Japanese units were scattered and unable to support one another effectively. Compounding the problem, American codebreakers had successfully deciphered Japanese communications, granting them precise knowledge of the timing and location of the assault. This exposed a critical vulnerability in intelligence and security. While Japanese officers did not fully grasp the extent of the compromise, they recognized enough to be gravely concerned. Every operational plan, ship movement, and strategic intent risked being revealed to the enemy before execution. Conducting a war under such conditions, where the adversary can anticipate your every move, is extraordinarily difficult and placed Japan at a severe, almost insurmountable disadvantage. The discussion turned to what might have unfolded had Japan chosen a different path. What if the United States had never been attacked directly? What if Japanese forces had limited their assaults to British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia? Would America have intervened at all? Opinions were divided. While President Roosevelt personally favored war against Germany and Japan, American public sentiment in 1941 remained staunchly isolationist. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, Congress may not have declared war immediately, and Japan could have enjoyed months, or even years, of unopposed expansion to strengthen its hold on conquered territories. Instead, the surprise attack delivered precisely what Roosevelt needed: a united, outraged nation demanding retaliation and propelling the United States fully into the conflict, eliminating any doubt about America's entry into World War II. Another possibility discussed was whether a more comprehensive strike on Pearl Harbor might have changed the war's trajectory. What if Nagumo had authorized a third wave targeting the fuel depots, repair yards, and submarine base? Some officers had urged this course during the planning stages, but Nagumo had declined, wary of potential American counterattacks and intent on preserving his forces. Viewed in retrospect, this cautious decision appeared catastrophic. Had those critical facilities been destroyed, American Pacific operations might have been set back by 6 months or longer, a delay Japan urgently needed to consolidate its gains and strengthen its strategic position in the early stages of the conflict. Yet the admirals confronted a harsh reality. Even a more devastating strike on Pearl Harbor could not have altered the eventual outcome. The issue was not one of tactics, but of strategy. Japan's economy was only a fraction the size of America's, and its industrial capacity barely reached a tenth of the United States. Without imports, Japan produced virtually no oil, a critical resource for sustained warfare. Its population was less than half that of America. In a prolonged conflict of attrition, these structural imbalances made defeat all but inevitable, regardless of battlefield successes or temporary advantages. Yamamoto had recognized the truth from the outset. He had opposed war with the United States, warning that Japan lacked any realistic chance of victory. Yet his objections were overruled by army leaders and civilian officials who assumed American democracy was weak, that the American people lacked the determination for a prolonged conflict, and that a swift string of Japanese victories would compel surrender. Every one of these assumptions was collapsing under the weight of reality, each proving disastrously mistaken as the United States mobilized its industrial, military, and human resources with relentless determination. Captain Fukuda delivered the depressing assessment of all: Japan's oil predicament. The nation's entire strategic planning had hinged on securing petroleum from the Dutch East Indies, a resource critical for both military and industrial purposes. American embargoes had already threatened to strangle Japan's economy, and capturing the Indonesian oil fields was intended as a solution. While Japan had succeeded in taking these fields largely intact, the victory introduced new challenges. Transporting the oil back to the home islands required tankers to traverse seas increasingly patrolled by American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had imported roughly 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, that number had fallen to 250,000 tons. The trajectory was unmistakable. If submarine attacks continued, by 1943 Japan's oil imports could be reduced to levels incapable of sustaining military operations. In essence, Japan might control the oil fields, yet lack any reliable means to deliver the fuel necessary to power its war machine. The admirals debated whether any route to victory remained. One idea was to inflict sufficient losses on American forces, hoping that the cost of continued engagement might sway public opinion and force Washington to reconsider the war. Intelligence assessments, however, quickly dispelled this notion. Americans appeared far more resilient and determined than Japanese planners had anticipated. Reports of atrocities, including the Bataan Death March and the mistreatment of prisoners, had only intensified the desire for retribution. Rather than prompting hesitation, these events fueled a national resolve for total victory. Unlike other nations that might have recoiled to high casualties, the United States seemed galvanized by them, driven not by calculated costs and benefits, but by outrage and a singular determination to punish and defeat Japan completely. In addition, American strategies were rapidly adapting to reduce their own casualties. Instead of reckless frontal assaults, U.S. forces relied on overwhelming firepower, coordinated air dominance, and superior material resources to systematically wear down Japanese defenses while preserving their troops. The Americans approached the conflict as an industrial war, applying logistics, production capacity, and careful planning to sustain continuous pressure. Every engagement was calculated to maximize effectiveness, turning America's vast resources into a decisive advantage that Japan could neither match nor counter effectively. The meeting turned to the situation unfolding in the Solomon Islands, where American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August. Japanese troops were fighting fiercely to push them back, but the admirals understood that this was more than a single engagement. It reflected a broader American strategy. The U.S. was systematically seizing forward bases, constructing airfields, and using them to project control over surrounding areas before moving on to the next objective. The approach was deliberate, grinding, and highly effective. Japan lacked the logistical infrastructure to respond adequately, and its industrial output was insufficient to match the continual flow of American reinforcements, aircraft, and ships. Each confrontation was turning into a war of attrition, and at every level, from manpower to material, Japan was falling behind, unable to sustain the losses that the Americans could absorb with relative ease. The final document under review was an economic report from the Finance Ministry, projecting Japan's capacity to sustain the war through 1945 under multiple scenarios. Even the most favorable forecasts indicated a collapse by late 1944. Japan's industrial and financial resources were simply insufficient to maintain prolonged military operations. With the nation already 8 months into the conflict, the report underscored a grim reality. Time was running out, and the window to alter the trajectory of the war was rapidly closing. The admirals came to a grim and unavoidable verdict. While Pearl Harbor had succeeded in its immediate tactical objectives, it had become a strategic disaster of monumental proportions. The attack accomplished none of Japan's essential goals, and, instead, united and inflamed the very enemy Japan had hoped to deter. With a balance of resources, industrial capacity, and public will overwhelmingly favoring the United States, victory was impossible. The only uncertainty remaining was the scale of devastation Japan would suffer before confronting the inevitable defeat. Admiral Yamaguchi suggested that the higher command be urged to pursue peace negotiations at once, before the situation worsened irreparably. His recommendation was dismissed, not from doubt over the analysis, but because any counsel of caution would be ignored, or, worse, condemned as defeatism or treason. The military government was impervious to hard truths. Its leaders were steadfastly committed to a total, unyielding war, indifferent to the mounting evidence that continued conflict would bring only greater suffering and inevitable collapse. The meeting ended without resolutions or proposals, leaving only a grim, shared recognition of reality. Japan's defeat had been sealed on December 7, 1941. It simply had yet to be acknowledged. The admirals departed, resuming their duties, orchestrating campaigns they knew were doomed, continuing a war already lost. August 6, 1942, the day Japanese naval leaders fully understood that Pearl Harbor, once hailed as a daring triumph, had in fact marked the irreversible turning point toward their nation's ruin.